Shalom, everybody. This is Brian Newman. I'm the host of Let's Talk Shalom. We're here at WCTN twice a week, right after Discovering the Jewish Jesus. And I'm here with Jonathan Brown, who's my pastor and my friend. And Jonathan and I actually co-founded a congregation here in Cleveland, Tennessee. If you ever want to come by, it's called Nehemiah Restoration Fellowship. We meet at 3 p.m. on Saturdays. We have a service, and then afterwards we have what's called oneg in Hebrew, which is like a fellowship meal. It's a potluck. And it's always really good. And that's at 1826 Dalton Pike, the Jerusalem Acres building, if you guys have ever seen that. And nrfcommunity.org is our website for Nehemiah Restoration Fellowship. So this is Jonathan. So you're a pastor, an elder, both, or how's all that work?
Yeah. The different sort of leadership models get confusing, and they kind of span the breadth of denominations. For us, what we see as the most biblical, leadership model is, at its core, it's a plurality of leadership. Mm-hmm. You know, when Paul writes a letter, he writes it to the elders, plural, and the overseers, plural, and the deacons, plural, of a congregation. And so with us, we started with three of us that were serving as elder, overseer, as well as pastoring, kind of sharing the burden. And for our group, we're currently down just to myself as pastor and elder. But that is sort of our model, is to have and maintain a plurality of leadership, to keep people accountable, and to maintain a sort of balance and a transparency in leadership.
Awesome. And how long have you been doing that?
Somewhat since the very beginning of this year. We had evaluations. The way that we did it was essentially the congregation would nominate someone and then approve them to be put forward for leadership. And we had some additional meetings, really getting in there and asking kind of the hard personal questions about people and their background, their faith, where they've been, what they've done, that sort of thing, to make sure that they really are scripturally qualified. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a lot of requirements that are laid out in Paul's pastoral letters of 1 Timothy and Titus. And so we took a lot of the principles and the guidelines out of those letters and kind of made them applicable to our own modern scenario. Mm-hmm. So since that was pretty much January of this year. Yeah. So really since January I've been serving in this position, and we've had public meetings since April of this year. Awesome.
So it's a good leadership model, because so many congregations, especially throughout home groups, it's whoever's the loudest, whoever is the most confident, whoever's the bossiest. Sometimes it rises leadership without any real screening, and then disastrous things happen. And then if you are in leadership, there's no accountability sometimes, and because there's just one leader, he can't go anywhere else for mentorship or counseling, and no one can say anything to him. But we try to have that plurality of leadership, even though there's just one. You know, you're accountable congregation, and the congregation is accountable to each other. And hopefully soon we'll have a replacement, because we started out with two, like you said.
Yeah. We started out with three, technically.
Well, three.
But right. The others, they actually ended up moving out of state. So it wasn't, anything catastrophic that happened. Just, life kind of happened, and different opportunities, jobs, and that sort of thing brought people out of state. And so they're no longer meeting and congregating with us, but it's just because they themselves had different opportunities to pursue.
And what educational background do you have in pursuing as far as leadership goes? And is that necessary? Do you have to go to seminary to be a pastor? Or do you have to get some kind of, is there a certain minimum education that should be required?
Well, that's also a sort of thing that will vary by denomination. For my perspective, I'm actually in my last year right now of a master's in biblical languages. Mm-hmm. I usually respond to this question by telling people that you don't have to be a seminary graduate to be a capable minister. But you do need to be trained. You do need to be equipped. Whether you've been discipled one-on-one, whether you've been to seminary, there are things that you need to be trained in as far as how to interpret Scripture, understanding biblical languages, understanding how to lead a congregation, and so on. So there are these things that you do need to know. And seminary is good because those are the places that people go to be discipled and to learn those things. It's not the only way. Yeah. And in fact, way back in the day, there was no such thing as seminary. Yeah. And you would follow your own teacher. In the first century world that Jesus grew up in, what that meant was you had a great teacher, a great rabbi, you followed him as his student. And he taught you to be just like him. So before the seminaries and such, that was the model. And so from my perspective, I usually advise people, if you can be discipled one-on-one by a pastor, elder, rabbi, that sort of thing, then that's great. But if not, then seminaries is kind of the next best thing. You still have teachers instructing you in these same topics.
It's like in the first century, is there a blessing about the dust of your rabbi? There's a book by that title.
Yeah,
so
yeah. There's
Rabbi Jesus, the dust of Rabbi Jesus.
There's the idea being it's kind of the idea that you would follow your rabbi, your teacher, so closely that you'd be covered in his dust, because as he walks, kicks up dust behind him and it accumulates on you. And we try to emulate that even on a spiritual level within discipleship today, to say that we follow the Messiah so closely that we want to be caught up in his dust.
And it's not just intellectual knowledge. Well, I know it's about the Bible, but it's like you have to actually learn how to treat your wife, how to treat your children, how to treat the waitress at City Cafe when you go, the cashier at Walmart. And it's this whole lifestyle you learn that's hard to learn from just watching YouTube, just reading books. I mean, you can get some knowledge, but even it's unverified knowledge, unless you have some kind of formal training, someone can screen your knowledge, say, no, that's not accurate, or that's not true, or you're not applying that correctly. And then there's also the life stuff, like you're talking about. And it's also, there's an important need for counselors, for pastors to be teachers and counselors and administrators. So you have the business side, you have the leadership side, you have the knowledge, scripture side, and a certain amount maybe public speaking, and then you have the counseling side. And I've seen so many pastors, they're like purely counselors, or they're purely, teachers, or they're purely orators. And could you just talk about the importance of having those different skill sets or developing those skill sets, rather than just say, I read a book on this, or I watched YouTube for so long about this pastor, or I just went to church so many years, now I'm a leader.
Yeah, so, pastor at its core, the word itself it literally just means shepherd. Mm-hmm. Right, and that's kind of the idea. Is it doesn't mean ruler, it doesn't mean king, it doesn't mean any of those sorts of things. The biblical model of pastoring, of ministering to others, is being a servant first.
Yeah.
So the idea of the pastor as leader is, we like to see it that way because we like to view hierarchies of this guy's at the top and he calls the shots. Mm-hmm. But the biblical model of ministering to people and of being a leader is being the least, mm-hmm. right? Is by serving others. So that's a large portion of it. As far as the kind of curriculum, if you will, for pastors, there is a lot of varied work. But I think that's why in his letters to 1 Timothy and Titus, Paul lays down so many different qualifications that we would read them and say, well, this doesn't have anything to do with reading Hebrew and Greek, or with being able to deliver a good sermon. This only has to do with whether your kids respect you, and if you lead your household well, and if you're kind to strangers, and these sorts of things. Because you're dealing with people in the body. And as we all know, in this fallen world, people are messy.
Yeah.
And there's no perfect solution and no perfect formula for how to train up these leaders, but a lot of it is simply being involved in ministry, caring for people, caring for the flock. Again, mm-hmm. the metaphor of the shepherd. And being involved with seeing people be and achieve their best mm-hmm. in their own faith walk.
So raising everyone up to full kingdom capacity.
Yeah.
So I like that a lot. And the roles of elder and deacon and pastor and bishop and what, like at NRF, like what would a deacon do? My Restoration Fellowship, NRF, what would a deacon do versus an elder? What's the difference between those two? Because a lot of people read these terms and we're just kind of confused about who does what at a congregation.
Well, in the way it's traditionally been viewed, you have the typical evangelical model mm-hmm. is usually you have a head pastor, mm-hmm. maybe you have an associate pastor, maybe you have a youth pastor, that sort of thing. But in general, you have a head pastor that's kind of at the top.
Yeah.
And then below him is a board of elders. Mm-hmm. That's most common. And then below them are deacons. Yeah. That's usually the 3-tier system that you normally see. For us, we don't operate on that model. Mm-hmm. Paul never wrote a letter and said to the head pastor of Ephesus.
Yeah.
Right. He never said to the singular leader at Philippi. Right? It was always a plurality of leaders.
Of names of people.
Of people, of people co-serving. And he uses that term as well in his own letters, mm-hmm. such as in Romans 15. He says specifically, my co-workers, my co-laborers in ministry in the gospel. So as our structure has been, again, we started with a plurality of elders functioning in pastoral capacities. Now, as for deacons, we don't presently have that, but the model going forward is that the deaconship, if you will, would serve really in assisting elders in leading the congregation, in serving various functions. Some functions are simply, they're not necessarily religious in nature. Somebody has to get there early and turn on lights and set up. Somebody has to stay late and vacuum and wipe down tables and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of different pieces to come together when we have meetings, and especially for us, right? Because we meet at 3 o'clock and we're not usually leaving the building until maybe 9 p.m. We do sort of
trash and vacuuming and
we do sort of an all-day thing every week. So the offices, if you want to use the title, the offices of elder and deacon are really supposed to be kind of coming together and working together in service of the body. It's usually elders that are tasked with training and teaching, and deacons are kind of an assistant to the role of tending to the flock. Again, that shepherding metaphor.
So my understanding of Greek is extremely elementary, but elder is presbyteros? Presbyter?
So there's two words. There's episkopos and there's presbyteros. So episkopos is where you get the word episcopal,
like a bishop.
And then presbyteros is where you get the word presbytery. The difference between them is, yes, one is generally in most Bibles translated as bishop. Sometimes you'll see it as overseer. And the other is generally translated as elder.
And the deacon is basically one who serves?
Yes, and there's a whole word group in Greek that use the same diak, right? Diakonos is a word in Greek. There's a whole group of words that utilize that, but they really all sort of pertain to a working and assisting sort of function.
So the elders are more like the spiritual and the decision makers, and the deacons are the support personnel that make sure the practical needs are met, or is that the physical necessities, like this? Paul said serving tables, I believe. So.
That's, in general, that's kind of how those are distinguished,
And what about a bishop? How does that work? A bishop, is that a pastor, or is that someone over all the pastors in the city, or is that some kind of elder, or is?
Well, this gets to a huge level of debate. Again, denominationally, you'll see these things differently. Normally, in such more Orthodox churches, Anglican churches, that sort of thing, you'll have a bishop who is just that. They're basically the elder over elders. Now, a bishop is over, say, 10 congregations. And each congregation has its own elders, its own pastor or priest, depending on the denomination. So they have their own individual leaders at their church. And then there's a leader over that, again, expanding this sort of multi-tiered hierarchy. But the debate centers on the fact that Paul isn't consistent in the way that he uses elder versus bishop or overseer. And so that's what causes this disagreement. And entire denominations have formed because of that. You're obviously Presbyterian and Episcopalian. They use those terms themselves. Episcopalian being a branch of Anglicans. They see that same model. The church really continues from the Catholic Church, which is this idea of bishop here, and then under that are elders over different congregations, and then under that are the members of each individual churches. Versus something that is either at the individual level or just across the board, an elders model.
That's a good explanation, because I've read it like growing up. But I was a Baptist church. Like there's a preacher, and then there's like deacons, and that's it. That's all you have. You get a few elders, but I've never seen a bishop or a cardinal or anybody. So I was like, who are these people? What do they do?
Most evangelical denominations, as I understand it, don't have a presiding bishop over their pastorate, right? Their group of leaders. But again, the reason that there is that disagreement is in some cases because to many people they view that Paul uses overseer and elder almost interchangeably. So again, it's always in the plural. So when he's referring to the elders of this town or the overseers of this congregation and so on, that he's essentially using the terms interchangeably. So to them, it's not a separate office of a higher order. It's another reference to the same plural model.
And that's what's important in the languages. You would plural, singular, you can distinguish from these different words. Translations for things to know exactly what's being talked about. Because it seems so minor, we should just abstractly read the Bible, but when you're actually trying to apply it to a real life congregation, these make huge differences in people's lives and the clergy and the structure. and it's something to be aware of. And we're going to ask a rather touchy question, which is women in ministry, but we'll focus more on NRF, like the Nehemiah Restoration Fellowship. What's the NRF viewpoint on that, or what positions are open to women, and do we have a scriptural basis for that?
Well, that gets into a debate that's longer than the rest of today.
Or just our general congregational position.
The congregation hasn't adopted a position. Okay. I have my own views and opinions on it. I believe things are best served by giftings rather than trying to assign what someone's allowed to do or not allowed to do. If God has gifted someone with something, then it's their responsibility to be using it to serve the body. It's their responsibility to use that in service of the congregation, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, to the edification or the building up of the church, as well as using it to serve ultimately the Creator in their ministry function. Right now, we don't have anybody across the board that really wants to be in leadership. Put me in charge, which I almost consider that better. I consider that to be kind of a positive note, because it's normally the type of person who says, I should be doing this, I should be in charge, that shouldn't be in charge. As far as, at the very least, as far as church leadership goes, the type of person that you want to be a leader is the person that can lead by example, is the person that can lead in service, and is the person that can maintain humility. Because after all, that's what we're trying to model.
Without humility, the rest of it gets soured over time.
I mean, that's the model of Christ himself laying down his own life and being willing to wash feet, being willing to die, being willing to put aside ownership of the universe all the way down to die a criminal's death. So being willing to die to self is kind of the number one requirement. So we do have a number of very humble people. It's just a matter of, like I said, recognizing those giftings and callings within individual people and helping them come to fulfill their own callings.
Raise them up and their skills and interests and where the position and the service is needed. And where there's Anna the prophetess, Junia was an apostle, and I think Phoebe was a deaconess.
Yeah, Phoebe and Junia are both mentioned in Romans 15. Paul names a number of women alongside men that worked with him in his ministry. Of course, Priscilla is probably one of the most famous because Priscilla and Aquila are mentioned numerous times.
Working together.
Co-laborers, Again, he kind of likes that term. I don't think Paul often viewed himself as the guy at the top handing down orders as much as, look, I'm in the trenches with you. I'm laboring here, even from prison. I'm here for you. I'm here to serve, to set an example. He wasn't. I don't think he was afraid of utilizing apostolic authority, but I don't think his goal was, hey, listen to me because I'm the boss. I think it was more, emulate Christ, or emulate me as I emulate Christ.
Well, he said he sounds so strong in his letters, because when you meet me in person, you won't be as intimidated. So he was. It's so hard to get a clear view of someone's personality just through writing. We didn't meet him, we didn't see his voice. We didn't hear his voice, but he's such an impact on the world. And on Christianity, we'll go into that later, like Paul is this one figure who kind of overrides the rest of Scripture or has invented this new religion, and we'll talk about that in a different episode. But he did lay the halakha, or the way of walking things out, for the first century church, especially the Gentiles in the church, and also that Jewish-Christian merger. And transitioning to that, the question of, Paul comes along and because it's a whole new thing, or are you all Jewish still? And NRF it looks kind of like a hybrid, but so we'll start with the synagogue side, because Jonathan is very, very, very well versed in everything Jewish. What are the similarities between Nehemiah Restoration and synagogue? If you grew up Jewish and you came to believe in Yeshua or Jesus last week, your Rabbi Yeshua, and you wanted somewhere to go, how similar would our services look to what someone that maybe grew up conservative, Reformed Jewish would be familiar with? Well,
the starting point of similarity is obviously the day. Right. We meet on Saturdays. So that would be the most thing in common with the synagogue. We recite some of the traditional liturgy out of the Siddur, which is the Hebrew prayer book. All of the ones that we have that we do weekly are verses taken out of the Scripture itself. So we recite the Shema, which is from Deuteronomy 6, in Hebrew and in English.
Yeah.
We recite the Michamocha, which is from Exodus 15.
Yeah.
We do so multiple pieces of the liturgy, of the liturgical portion of our service, we recite in Hebrew and English, and that would be very common. You would see that in a typical synagogue. Most of the people there, especially the men, are usually wearing a tallit, which is a prayer shawl, which again you would see in pretty much any synagogue service. We are adding in a just recent addition, a Torah service. So normally, if you've been in a church service, you have worship music and you have some announcements and you hear a sermon. We've had some of those elements, and that's kind of the next question is kind of how it relates to a church. So we do have those elements, but the Torah service is specifically on each week. There's a different reading from the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it's on a set cycle throughout the year. So every year around September, October, it resets. You go back to Genesis 1:1.
Yeah.
And it's set. You have this week's portion, and then week 2 portion, the week 3 portion, and so on. And so one of the things that would be in common with the synagogue is any synagogue you go into on a given week, they're going to be talking about the same portion, regardless of which one you
around
went to.
the world. It's like the
around the world, yeah.
Catholic liturgy, or even the Lutherans seem to have
out of the lectionary.
The lectionary.
Yeah.
So wherever you go in the world, you're kind of at home. You know what's happening. You know what's going on. You're not lost. You don't have to start all over. And you have things in common with everyone there. Other than just being a believer, you've got all of this culture in common and know what's happening, so you can easily transition.
Yeah. So we do have the Torah service, which amounts to reading. You'll hear part of it read in Hebrew. You'll hear the exact same thing in English. And we do try to make that a point, especially in this area. Most people don't have a background of understanding Hebrew very well. So we do make it a point that if something is recited, if something is sang in one of the songs, if something is chanted or canted in the liturgy, anything that you hear in Hebrew, you will hear it in English as well.
So it's not like walking to like a pre-1955 Catholic church where it's all in Latin.
No.
You have no idea what's happening. It's English as well, so you know you're not saying anything blasphemous or strange.
Yeah, we make sure to maintain that. So you'd have a recitation from it in Hebrew. You'd have the same thing in English. And then you'd have a drash, which is really just kind of a commentary or an explanation. And that's considered a great honor to be called up as part of that service. So there are blessings that are recited over the person that's reading it, over the person that's giving the exposition or explaining the portion. And that can vary week to week who's actually doing that. But usually it'll be about 10, 15, 20 minutes of explanation just on that week's reading. Really digging into it, really explaining some of the important themes behind it, explaining and especially relating, why do I need to know this?
Yeah.
Because that's a part that people often miss is, okay, I know this thing, but why do I need to know this particular passage? Why do I need to know this about Genesis, about Exodus? Why do I need to know this random law? So making it applicable to people.
And real quickly, what we have in common with the regular church service? We believe in Jesus. You feel free to say Jesus if you call him Jesus instead of Yeshua, or any related Hebrew name. So what would we have in common with like a Baptist church, for example?
We'll still have our opening worship service. So there's still songs. Like I said, there's some Hebrew in them, but if there's also English. So we still have worship. We play multiple songs. We still have a time where we do announcements. We still have a time where
we have a potluck.
we do have potluck. Oneg, which Brian mentioned before. Every week we do that every week after service.
You have a sermon.
We do. Yeah. So the very last part of service, we finish up the Torah service. We actually call all the children up. They get blessed every single week.
Yeah.
And then they're dismissed to kids' class. And then the last part is the sermon, which is usually topical. Right now we're actually working through the fruit of the Spirit. So spending some reasonable amount of time on each one, really digging into it from Galatians 5.
And that's been a good sermon because those words are so closely related in English. When you dig into Greek and Hebrew, there's such a variance in meaning and such a broad concept of meaning, rather than just kind of words, but being nice and patient. There's a lot more context in there.
Yeah, and we can also get past the part of it being a buzzword and really dig into, okay, but how do I do it?
Exactly. It's not just something you put in your bathroom wall. This is a real life thing.
Yeah.
And so once again, you want to tell them this time where we meet and when we meet?
Yeah, so Nehemiah Restoration Fellowship. We meet every Saturday starting at 3 p.m. Service does run close to 2 hours for the whole thing, but we meet every Saturday 3 p.m. We meet in the sanctuary of the Jerusalem Acres building, and we're at 1826 Southeast Dalton Pike in Cleveland.
And do we have a phone number they can call if they have questions, or just an email?
Yeah, so, and again, the website has a lot of information for visitors, a statement of faith from us so everyone can see our level of orthodoxy, as well as a visiting page, some directions on people wanting to visit and so on. But the website is nrfcommunity.org, and the email address is on there, but it would be info@nrfcommunity.org.
And we have a YouTube channel with Jonathan's sermons.
We do, yeah. Nehemiah Restoration Fellowship. We have a YouTube channel. We also stream services every Sabbath, so we start at 3 p.m. You can go and follow and subscribe to the channel and get notified of when we go live. We try to stream the entire service from worship all the way through to the end of the Q&A at the end of the sermon.
And we have questions too. So if you're live streaming, you can feel free to pop in and ask a question. You can email a question. You can find us on Facebook, and somebody will answer your email. Or if you see me and Jonathan around Walmart, you can also just stop and, hey, I know you from NRF. Can you answer this question I have? And you can dress pretty and formally as long as it's modest and appropriate. Wear jeans. It's kind of like we are now. I'm in jeans. He's in a sweater.
Yep.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to the very first episode. Forgive my nervousness. But I have a great guest. And we're going to do a couple of these with Jonathan here, about different topics and about the Messianic Jewish movement, the history of the early Jewish church. And then next month, we're going to transition about the Sabbath and the feast, and also Hanukkah and Purim. So if you want to participate in those and understand those better, it's a great time to tune in to learn about the Hebrew roots of the Hebrew/Jewish roots of the Christian faith. And we appreciate everybody tuning in.